In September of 1883, Marta Elsdottir Voss stood at the edge of her property line in the Dakota Territory and studied the sky the way a person studies the face of someone they do not fully trust. She was 34 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and had been widowed for 11 months. The nearest town of any consequence was Vermilion, 17 miles to the southeast across a prairie that offered nothing between here and there except wind, grass, and the particular silence that settles over flat country when the temperature begins to fall. Her nearest neighbor, a German farmer named Heinrich Braun, lived 4.5 miles due west. He was a decent man who had brought smoked pork to her door the week Jonas died and had not come back since. That was the way of the territory. Grief was acknowledged once, and then the land moved on, because the land had no patience for prolonged mourning. What nobody in the Vermilion Basin knew that September morning, not Heinrich Braun, not the land agent Franklin Cord who handled claims along the river road, not the circuit preacher who passed through every 6 weeks on a horse that looked older than the territory itself, was that Marta Voss had been digging beneath her own cabin for 31 consecutive days. The hole she had made measured 14 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 6.5 feet from floor to ceiling at its deepest point. The walls were lined with stacked blocks of prairie sod, each one 18 inches thick, fitted together with the precision of a woman who had learned the technique from a grandfather who built turf houses on the volcanic coast of Iceland and understood, better than most men alive, what it meant to coax warmth from the earth itself. She had not told anyone. Not because she was ashamed, but because she already knew what they would say, and she had neither the time nor the patience to argue while the ground was still soft enough to dig. Before we go any further into this story, take a second right now to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. It genuinely helps more people find these accounts of forgotten history. Now let's get back to Marta. The story of what she built and why, and what it meant to every family within 12 miles of her claim when January arrived with temperatures that dropped to 41 degrees below zero and stayed there for 19 consecutive days. That story begins not in Dakota Territory, but on a rocky, wind-battered island in the North Atlantic, in a farmhouse made almost entirely of earth and grass, where a man named Sigurdur Elsdottir spent the better part of his life proving that human ingenuity, when properly aimed at a specific problem, can defeat conditions that should by any reasonable measure be unsurvivable. Sigurdur was Marta's maternal grandfather. He was born in 1801 on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula of western Iceland, the third son of a sheep farmer who had survived the Laki eruption of 1783 as a child, and who carried that survival in his bones for the rest of his life as a kind of permanent seriousness. The Laki eruption killed roughly a quarter of Iceland's population through famine, ash, and fluorine poisoning. It was the kind of event that rewired how a culture thought about preparation, shelter, and the relationship between human beings and the landscape they occupied. Sigurdur grew up in that rewired culture, and he built accordingly. The turf houses of Iceland, known in the old language as torfbær, were not primitive structures. That is the first and most important thing to understand about them, because the assumption of primitiveness is precisely the mistake that would later cause men in the Dakota Territory to dismiss what Marta Voss was doing beneath her cabin floor. Icelandic turf construction was the result of centuries of accumulated engineering knowledge, refined across generations of farmers who could not afford to get it wrong. The average winter temperature in Reykjavik hovers around 27 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior highlands, it drops considerably lower. The wind is constant and carries moisture that strips heat from any poorly designed structure within hours. Wood was scarce. Stone required specialized labor to cut and transport. What the land offered in abundance was earth and grass, and so Icelandic builders learned to use earth and grass with a sophistication that most contemporary observers entirely failed to recognize. The principle was simple, but the execution was not. Turf blocks cut from the surface of the ground retained not only their physical mass, but their insulating properties, because the root systems of the grass bound the soil into a structure that resisted compression and held pockets of trapped air within its matrix. A wall constructed of stacked turf blocks 18 inches thick possessed an insulating value that modern builders would measure at approximately R8 to R12 per section, depending on moisture content and compression. A full turf wall 3 feet thick, which was standard construction in Sigurdur's time, could maintain an interior temperature of 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit when the outside temperature dropped to 20 below zero, with no active heating whatsoever. Add a single oil lamp burning continuously in a well-sealed chamber, and that interior temperature climbed to 60 or 65 degrees. Add a small hearth, even one fed with dried peat or animal dung, and the space became genuinely warm in conditions that were otherwise lethal. Sigurdur did not merely live in these structures, he built them, modified them, and spent decades thinking about why some versions worked better than others. He understood that the key variable was not the thickness of the walls alone, but the relationship between thermal mass, air circulation, and moisture management. A turf wall that became saturated with water lost most of its insulating value because water conducts heat far more efficiently than trapped air. The great turf builders learned to manage moisture by angling their roofs to shed water away from the walls, by layering different densities of turf to create drainage gradients within the wall itself, and by ensuring that the air inside the structure stayed in gentle motion rather than stagnating against cold surfaces where condensation would form. Marta learned all of this at her grandfather's knee. She was 8 years old when she first helped him lay turf blocks for a repair on the north wall of the family bear. She was 12 when he explained to her why the underground portion of the structure stayed warmer than the above-ground portion, and why that was not an accident but a design choice that every serious builder made deliberately. The earth itself, he told her, is a heat battery. It absorbs energy from the summer sun and releases it slowly through the winter. At a depth of 6 feet, the ground temperature in Iceland stayed within a few degrees of 42 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of what the surface temperature was doing. That constant temperature was not warmth in any comfortable sense, but it was a foundation. It was something to build from. And in the business of keeping people alive through northern winters, having a reliable foundation was more valuable than almost anything else a builder could provide. She was 21 when she left Iceland with her husband Jonas Voss, a Danish-born carpenter who had worked the herring fleets out of Akureyri and had heard enough stories about American land grants to convince himself that the Dakota Territory represented an opportunity worth the crossing. They arrived in New York in the spring of 1870, spent 2 years in a Minnesota mill town where Jonas worked lumber and Marta took in sewing, and finally filed their homestead claim on 160 acres of Dakota bottomland in the spring of 1873. The land was flat, the soil was deep, and the winters, as several people at the land office in Yankton felt obligated to mention, were something a person needed to experience to fully believe. Jonas was a good builder. He constructed their cabin from cottonwood logs he cut along the river 2 miles east of the claim, notching the corners with the precision his Scandinavian background demanded, and laying a sod roof over a frame of willow poles. The floor was packed earth covered with puncheon boards, split logs laid flat side up and pegged together, and beneath that floor, the clay subsoil of the Dakota prairie ran down to bedrock at depths that varied from 8 to 14 feet, depending on where you dug. The cabin measured 22 feet long and 16 feet wide, with a single window on the south wall and a stone fireplace on the east end that Jonas had built from river cobbles mortared with clay. It was, by the standards of the territory, a solid and well-considered structure. It kept them warm through 7 winters. Then Jonas died in October of 1882, 3 days after a harrow blade slipped and opened a wound on his left thigh that went septic before Dr. Albright in Vermilion could be summoned. He was 44 years old. He left Marta with the claim, the cabin, a team of horses named Burke and Sol, 11 laying hens, 2 milk cows, and a debt of $63 to the general store in Vermilion that represented 2 seasons of supplies, charged against the expectation of a wheat harvest that the summer drought of 1882 had reduced to almost nothing. She did not consider leaving. That fact is important to understand because several people suggested it to her in the months that followed. Franklin Cord, the land agent, came out in November of 1882 and sat in her cabin with his hat in his hands and explained in what he clearly believed was a sympathetic tone that a widow alone on a claim of this size, without sons old enough to work and without family within 1,000 miles, was in a situation that the territory had seen before and that rarely ended well. He knew a man in Yankton who would give her a fair price for the claim. She could go back to Minnesota. She could find a position in a household. She had time yet to make a reasonable life for herself somewhere that the isolation would not work against her. Marta listened to him until he finished. Then she poured him a second cup of coffee and told him that she had not crossed the North Atlantic to become a housekeeper in Minnesota, and that she would appreciate it if he would direct his concern toward claims that were actually in distress. Cord left with the slightly rearranged expression of a man who had expected gratitude and received refusal, and Marta did not see him again until the following spring, under circumstances that altered his opinion of her considerably. The idea came to her in February of 1883, during the worst cold snap of that winter, when the temperature outside fell to 33 degrees below zero, and the wind out of the northwest drove it lower still. She had enough firewood. Jonas had always cut generous quantities, and she had continued the practice. But the wood was stacked outside in the traditional way, against the north wall of the cabin under the overhang, and the cold had turned it into something closer to iron than fuel. The logs were frozen together where they touched. The moisture that remained in the outer layers of unseasoned wood had crystallized and expanded, splitting several pieces along their grain lines. Getting the fire started each morning required 30 to 40 minutes of patient, frozen-fingered work, scraping bark, splitting kindling from pieces that sometimes shattered like glass rather than cleaving clean, coaxing a flame from a starter that itself was cold enough to blunt the striking surface of a flint. She was kneeling by the hearth at 4 in the morning, feeding the fire back to life with one hand and holding a blanket around her shoulders with the other, when she thought of her grandfather's voice. At 6 feet deep, the ground never lies to you. It tells you exactly what it knows, which is this: there is always warmth if you know where to look for it. She did not go back to sleep that night. By the time grey light came through the south window, she had the outline of a plan that she recognized, with the particular clarity that comes from having inherited both the knowledge and the stubbornness to use it, as something that was going to work. The cabin sat on a foundation of river cobbles and fieldstone, with the floor joists running east to west and the puncheon board floor resting on top of them. The space between the bottom of the floor joists and the surface of the earth beneath was 16 inches at its lowest point and just under 24 inches at its highest, because the ground inside the cabin's footprint had never been leveled precisely, and the slight natural slope of the land ran from north to south at a grade of roughly 3 inches over the full 16 feet of the cabin's width. This meant that the southern portion of the underfloor space was marginally deeper, and it was there, directly beneath the hearthstone at the cabin's east end, that Marta Voss decided she would begin. The plan, as she worked it out over the following 3 days on paper she saved from flour sack wrappings, was this: she would remove a section of the puncheon floor, measuring 4 feet by 4 feet, directly beside the fireplace hearth. She would excavate the earth below to a depth of 6.5 feet, extending the chamber outward in all directions until it measured 14 feet from north to south and 8 feet from east to west, leaving a margin of at least 2 feet around every foundation stone and cobble. She would line the walls with sod blocks cut from the surface of the prairie, the same species of dense, root-bound prairie sod that Icelandic builders had used for centuries, different in its grass composition but functionally similar in its insulating properties. She would lay a floor of packed gravel over the existing clay with a slight slope toward a drainage sump in the northeast corner. She would create 2 ventilation shafts, each one 8 inches in diameter, angled upward through the earth and exiting beneath the cabin's skirting boards at points chosen to take advantage of the prevailing wind direction. And she would build, at the foot of the fireplace's east wall, a small auxiliary heating alcove, a pocket in the turf lining just large enough to hold a single oil lamp in a clay housing that would radiate heat into the chamber without risk of fire to the surrounding insulation. The result, if she executed it correctly, would be a chamber that maintained itself at 45 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit through the ground temperature alone. That could be raised to 62 to 65 degrees with a single burning lamp. And that could serve as a shelter of last resort for herself and any other person who needed refuge from conditions on the surface that had become genuinely unsurvivable. It would not be comfortable in the way a heated cabin was comfortable, but it would be survivable in conditions that the surface, by comparison, would not. She started digging in the last week of March 1883, when the ground thawed enough to work with a spade. The first task was removing a section of the puncheon floor, which she accomplished in an afternoon using a pry bar and a handsaw. She numbered each board with chalk before she pulled them up so that she could replace them in order when the work was done. The trap access she planned to cut, a hinged section measuring 3 feet by 2 feet, fitted with a rope pull and a wooden peg latch on the underside, would go back into this opening when the excavation was complete, and she intended it to be invisible to anyone who did not already know it was there. The digging was the hardest physical labor she had ever performed. She worked in 2-hour rotations, going down the makeshift ladder she had built from cottonwood rungs and a pair of straight willow poles, filling a clay-lined bucket she had made from a rendered-down barrel bottom, hauling the bucket up by rope and depositing the earth in a growing pile 40 feet north of the cabin, where it would eventually be used to fill in a drainage channel she had been planning to build along the cabin's north face anyway. The soil in the upper 2 feet was a mixture of topsoil and clay subsoil that came away in chunks when she worked it with the short-handled spade her grandfather had given her when she left Iceland, a tool made by a Reykjavik blacksmith to the specifications Sigurdur had worked out over a lifetime of turf building, with a blade angled at 11 degrees from the shaft to allow efficient cutting in close horizontal spaces. Below 2 feet, the soil transitioned to a dense, blue-gray clay that held its shape so well it required almost no shoring during the excavation. This was luck, but it was the kind of luck that only appears to people who have already done enough preparation to recognize and use it. She worked alone for the first 3 weeks. Then her nearest female neighbor, a Bohemian woman named Anna Blazek, who lived 6 miles east on a claim her husband Joseph had proved up the previous year, came by on a Wednesday in early April to return a borrowed canning jar, and found Marta emerging from the hole in her floor, covered in blue clay and moving with the focused expression of a woman who is doing the thing she has decided to do and has no intention of explaining herself to anyone. Anna set the canning jar on the table, looked at the hole and said, in the careful English she had been constructing word by word since her arrival 3 years prior, "What is it that you are making?" Marta told her. She explained the Icelandic principle, the thermal mass of the earth, the role of the turf lining, the ventilation system, the oil lamp alcove. She drew the dimensions on the back of the flour sack paper she had been using for her calculations. Anna listened with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have survived hard circumstances through intelligence rather than luck, and who recognize practical knowledge when they encounter it. When Marta finished, Anna said nothing for a moment. Then she said, My grandmother in Bohemia. She had a place beneath the farmhouse where they went when the soldiers came. The earth, it stayed warm even in January. We thought it was magic. Marta said it was not magic. Anna said she knew that now, but that it had seemed like magic when she was 7 years old and there were soldiers burning houses on the road above. They worked together for 3 Wednesdays after that, and Anna never told Josef where she was going, and Marta never asked her to explain. By the middle of May, the chamber was roughed in. The excavation measured 14 feet by 8 feet and 6.5 feet at its deepest point, exactly as the plan specified. Marta had shored the foundation stones and cobbles with additional fieldstone packed tight against their bases, distributing the load of the floor joists across a wider footprint so that removing the earth immediately around them had not compromised their bearing capacity. She had confirmed this by watching the cabin walls carefully during and after the excavation. No cracks appeared, no doors shifted in their frames, no gaps opened at the corners between the log courses. The structure above her work was sound. The sod cutting began in late May, after she had identified the right location on her property. She needed dense, root-bound sod that had not been broken by a plow and that had sufficient depth, at least 4 inches of root mass below the grass surface, to hold together when cut into blocks. She found it on a half-acre of north-facing slope on the western edge of her claim, where the grass was shorter and tougher than the valley bottom growth and the root systems ran deep into the clay below. She cut blocks 8 inches tall, 18 inches long, and 4 inches deep, using a tool she made herself by modifying a flat spade with a wooden guide rail that kept the cut dimensions consistent. Each block weighed approximately 11 pounds. She needed enough to cover roughly 240 square feet of wall surface at an 18-inch thickness, which meant she would be cutting and hauling approximately 900 individual blocks. It took her 6 weeks. She loaded the blocks onto a flat stone boat she made from planks salvaged from an old wagon bed, pulled it with Sul across the prairie to the cabin, and passed the blocks down through the floor opening one by one, stacking them temporarily in the chamber while she worked out the final layout. The actual wall construction took another 3 weeks because fitting turf blocks into an underground chamber that already had existing earth walls required trimming, testing, and occasionally recutting blocks that did not sit flush. She worked from the bottom up, staggering the joints between courses the way her grandfather had taught her, packing loose soil into any gap larger than a finger's width, and sloping the top of each wall section slightly inward so that any moisture that condensed on the surface would run down into the joint rather than dripping into the interior of the chamber. The ventilation shafts went in during the first week of July. She bored them using a technique Sigurdur had shown her, a pointed iron rod driven in increments and then withdrawn, the loose soil cleared with a flexible willow wand, the process repeated until the shaft broke through to the surface. Each shaft was 8 inches in diameter and angled upward at approximately 30 degrees from horizontal, so that the surface opening sat under the cabin's skirting boards and was sheltered from direct wind while still being positioned to take advantage of the pressure differential that the wind created as it passed across the skirting. She lined the shafts with rings of fired clay she made herself from the excavated clay soil, firing them in the cabin's hearth over 3 nights until they were hard enough to hold their shape. The rings were 4 inches long and fitted together with a slight overlap, sealing the shaft walls against collapse and moisture intrusion. The oil lamp alcove at the base of the fireplace wall was the most precise piece of work in the entire project. She excavated a pocket in the turf lining 14 inches deep, 18 inches wide, and 12 inches tall, positioning it at floor level where warm air would rise naturally into the room. She lined the pocket with a layer of flat stones she had selected from the river, fine-grained, dense stones that absorbed heat readily and released it slowly, functioning as a thermal battery for the warmth generated by the lamp. The lamp housing itself she built from fired clay, with a chimney channel 3 inches in diameter that ran up through the turf wall and connected to the east ventilation shaft, ensuring that any combustion gases from the lamp would exit the chamber rather than accumulating in the closed underground space. She tested this by burning a lamp for 4 hours with the trap door closed and then opening it and holding a candle flame at the connection point where the lamp chimney met the ventilation shaft. The flame pulled toward the shaft. The draft was working. She closed the trapdoor for the first time on a Tuesday evening in late July. The temperature outside was 71 degrees Fahrenheit, which was warm for that time of year in Dakota Territory. She descended into the chamber with a thermometer she had borrowed from Dr. Albright in Vermilion on the pretext of checking whether her root vegetables were storing at the right temperature, which was true as far as it went. The thermometer read 46 degrees in the chamber. She lit the oil lamp, closed the trapdoor above her, and sat on a flat stone she had placed as a seat in the southeast corner of the room. She stayed for 2 hours. When she climbed back up into the cabin, the thermometer read 61 degrees, and the lamp had burned approximately 1/3 of a cup of coal oil. 1 cup of coal oil, she calculated, would maintain 60 degrees of warmth in that chamber for 6 hours. 6 hours was enough to sleep. 6 hours was enough to survive the coldest portion of any night, even a January night in Dakota Territory. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time after that, very still, with the expression of a person who has just confirmed something they already believed but needed to prove. Franklin Cord was the first person to find out. He came by in August on a routine land inspection, or so he described it, and arrived to find Marta nailing the trap door frame into its final position in the puncheon floor beside the hearth. He stood in the cabin doorway looking at the frame, then at her, then at the floor where she had not yet replaced the surrounding boards, and he put 2 and 2 together with the quickness of a man who spent his professional life assessing what people were doing with land. "What in the world is that?" he said. She told him. Cord stepped inside and crouched at the edge of the opening, looking down into the chamber below with the lantern she handed him. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You dug that yourself?" She said she had. He said, "How deep?" She said 6.5 feet at the deepest, 14 by 8 overall. He stood up and handed back the lantern and said, "Mrs. Voss, I will be honest with you. I came out here expecting to find a woman who was not managing well. I can see I was incorrect." He paused. He also said, "That chamber is going to fill with water the first heavy rain." She showed him the drainage sump in the northeast corner and the grade of the gravel floor that ran toward it. She showed him the ventilation shafts and explained how the angle prevented surface water from running in. He examined both shafts. He tapped the turf walls. He pressed his thumb against the clay floor and found it hard and dry. He said, "I'll be damned." She said she could not speak to that. He laughed, which surprised her somewhat, and he left shortly after with the more complicated expression of a man who has been forced to revise a settled opinion. The second objection came from Heinrich Braun, who appeared at her door in September with a jar of pickled beets his wife Clara had sent, and a look on his face that suggested he had heard about the chamber from someone in Vermilion, probably Cord, who Marta had asked to keep the matter quiet, but who had apparently mentioned it to at least one person at the general store. Heinrich was a practical man, a Württemberg-born farmer who had spent 12 years in Dakota Territory and who trusted his own experience over almost any other form of evidence. He had survived the winter of 1880 to 1881, which had killed cattle in their stalls and frozen well pumps solid across the territory, and he had done it by cutting wood in extraordinary quantities and stacking it in a proper above-ground shed with a pitched roof and open sides for air circulation. That method had worked. He saw no particular reason to deviate from what had worked. He said this to Marta while standing in her cabin and studying the closed trap door with an expression of considered skepticism. She opened the door, and invited him to go down. He descended the ladder with his own lamp and spent about 15 minutes in the chamber, examining the walls, pressing the turf, inspecting the ventilation shafts, finding the drainage sump, and generally bringing the rigorous assessment of a man who has built 2 barns and a proper root cellar to a project that was not quite any of those things. When he came back up, he said the turf will hold moisture in a wet year. She said she had angled the outer surface of each block to shed water and had laid the courses to create drainage channels within the wall itself. He said, "And the ventilation. You have tested this in winter cold." She said she had not yet, because it was not yet winter, but she had tested it with the trapdoor closed and the lamp burning and found the draft sufficient. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is an unusual thing to build." She said she knew. He said, "If it fails, you will tell me." She said she would. He went home, and she thought that was the end of it, but it was not, because 4 days later he came back with a post-hole auger and 2 hours of unannounced labor and helped her seal a gap in the north ventilation shaft that she had not quite managed to close correctly on her own. He did not say anything about it. He just fixed it and went home. That was Heinrich Braun. Dr. Albright arrived in October, ostensibly to check on a cough she had mentioned to him in a letter she had written about an entirely different matter. He was a Yale-educated physician who had come to Dakota Territory for reasons that were never entirely clear, and who had stayed for reasons that were even less clear. And he brought to every situation the particular combination of genuine intelligence and institutional confidence that belongs to men who have been educated expensively and know it. He examined the chamber with the careful attention of a man who is looking for something specific to criticize and is frustrated by his inability to find it. He pointed out that an underground space with an open flame inside it posed risks from carbon monoxide accumulation. Marta showed him the lamp chimney channel and the ventilation shaft it connected to. He tested the draft by holding his finger in the shaft opening and confirmed that air was moving. He said, "The lamp still produces some carbon monoxide regardless of draft efficiency." She said she knew, and that she had calculated the lamp's output against the chamber's volume and the estimated air exchange rate through the ventilation system, and determined that the accumulation in a 6-hour period would not reach a dangerous threshold. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. Then he said, "Where did you study chemistry?" She said she had not. He said, "You worked that out yourself." She said her grandfather had explained the principles to her when she was a child, and she had done the arithmetic. He was quiet again. Then he said, "It is a reasonable design." He also said, "If you are ever in that chamber and you notice the lamp flame turning blue at the base or the room beginning to feel strange, you open the trapdoor immediately and do not take anything with you." She said she understood. He left without saying anything further. But a week later she found, tucked inside her mailbox at the Vermilion post office, a folded sheet of paper in his handwriting that listed the signs of carbon monoxide poisoning in order of progression. She kept it in the tin box where she stored important documents. The circuit preacher, a lanky Missouri-born man named Elias Peck, who held services in 4 different settlements on a rotating schedule and who had opinions about almost everything, arrived in the 3rd week of October and heard about the chamber from Anna Blazek, who had apparently mentioned it to Joseph, who had mentioned it at the grain elevator in Vermilion. Peck was not a malicious man, but he had the frontier preacher's characteristic tendency to frame everything in terms of providence and its corollaries, and he regarded a woman digging a secret room beneath her own cabin as something that warranted pastoral attention. He sat across from Marta at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a look of worried authority and explained, in the measured tones of a man who believed himself to be delivering important news gently, that a woman in her situation, a widow, alone, without family or congregation to guide her, was particularly susceptible to the kind of pride that led people to trust their own judgment over the accumulated wisdom of their community. Marta let him finish. Then she said, "Reverend Peck, my grandfather built houses of earth that kept people alive through Icelandic winters. That knowledge is in my hands. If I do not use it, I am the one being prideful, because I am deciding that my discomfort with other people's opinions is more important than my obligation to use what I have been given." Peck opened his mouth and closed it again. He said, "I am not sure that is precisely what pride means." She said she was not sure either, but that she was going to finish the chamber regardless, and that she hoped he would trust her to manage her relationship with Providence on her own. He drank his coffee and left with an expression that suggested he was going to think about that for a while. She did not see him again until February, when he arrived at her door on a horse that was barely moving, and his own hands were so cold he could not open the saddlebag buckles. And she brought him inside, and then down through the trap door, into the chamber where the lamp had already been burning for 3 hours, and the temperature was 63 degrees. And he sat on the flat stone in the southeast corner and held his hands out toward the lamp housing and said nothing at all for a very long time. November came in at 12 degrees above zero and held there for 2 weeks before dropping to -8 on the 14th and -23 on the 21st. The external thermometer Jonas had nailed to the cabin's south wall, a merchant-grade instrument he had bought in Yankton for 40 cents, read -31 on the morning of November 28th. The wind was out of the northwest at approximately 30 miles per hour. The effective temperature, accounting for wind chill by the calculations that experienced homesteaders in the territory had worked out empirically over years of survival by observation, was somewhere below -50. Snow had been falling intermittently for 4 days and had accumulated to 22 inches on level ground. In the drawers and behind any obstruction, it had drifted to depths of 5 and 6 feet. Marta knew what was coming before it arrived, the way you know it when you have paid close enough attention to the landscape around you to understand what its particular silences and colors are trying to communicate. On the morning of November 27th, before the storm that would define the winter of 1883 in the territory's historical memory had fully arrived, she opened the trap door and descended into the chamber and lit the lamp and confirmed that the temperature was 47 degrees with no active heating. She added 3 additional stones to the lamp housing, stones she had selected specifically for their heat retention, dense river cobbles that could absorb warmth for hours and release it slowly. And she brought down 4 gallons of water in sealed crockery jars, 2 days' worth of dried meat and hardtack, 2 wool blankets, the tin box with her important documents, and the short-handled spade her grandfather had given her, which she brought not because she expected to need it underground, but because some things you carry not for their practical use in the immediate moment, but because they are the physical form of everything that made you capable of surviving the immediate moment in the first place. Then she went back upstairs and waited. The storm arrived before noon on November 28th and did not leave for 6 days. The temperature outside fell from -23 to -38 over the course of the first afternoon. By the second morning it was -41, and the wind had built drifts against the north wall of the cabin that reached the eave line and blocked the window on that side entirely. The south window showed nothing but white. The world above the surface of the ground had ceased to exist as a habitable environment by any definition that meant anything to a living creature. Inside the cabin, the fire in the hearth consumed wood at a rate that told Marta immediately that her supply, stacked outside under the north wall overhang, which was now buried under 5 feet of packed snow, was going to be difficult to access and impossible to supplement. She managed it carefully, burning small amounts at calculated intervals to maintain a temperature in the cabin that was uncomfortable but not dangerous, around 40 degrees in the center of the room, dropping to 32 near the walls. She wore every piece of wool she owned and slept in her chair beside the hearth. On the third day, when the wood supply she had managed to bring inside before the storm peaked began to run low, she opened the trap door. The chamber below was 51 degrees. The lamp was burning steadily. The ventilation was working. She confirmed this by watching the lamp flame, which burned straight and clean rather than flickering or showing the wavering that indicated disrupted airflow. She brought her 2 remaining pieces of split wood down through the trapdoor and fed them to the lamp alcove stones, adding their heat to the chamber. She pulled the trapdoor closed above her, wrapped herself in both wool blankets, and slept for 9 hours on the gravel floor with her back against the southeast wall where the turf was thickest and the temperature was highest. When she woke, the chamber was 55 degrees and the lamp was still burning. On the 4th day, Heinrich Braun's eldest son, Karl, appeared at her door. He was 19 years old and had covered 4.5 miles in conditions that should have been fatal by moving from one patch of visible fence post to the next. A technique his father had taught him as a matter of principle in case he ever needed to cross open country in a blizzard. His hands were inside his coat against his chest. The exposed skin of his face was the particular waxy white of tissue that has been to the edge of frostbite and is deciding which side to come down on. He came in without saying anything and stood near the hearth, which had barely enough fire in it to call itself a hearth. Marta had him down through the trapdoor in 90 seconds. He had never been in the chamber and he stared at it the way people stare at things that contradict their understanding of what is possible. The temperature was 53 degrees. The lamp was burning. The stones in the alcove held warmth. She gave him dried meat and water from the crockery and had him hold his hands near the lamp housing without touching it until sensation began to return, which it did slowly and painfully over the course of about 40 minutes, which was the normal course of events with hands that had been that cold. He stayed for 6 hours. When he went back, the weather had moderated slightly. -28, wind diminished to perhaps 15 miles per hour. He could see fence posts again. He made it home. The following day, with the storm finally beginning to break, Marta climbed out of the chamber for the first time in 2 days and dug through the snow to her wood supply. The logs near the wall were frozen together in a mass that required the back of an axe to break apart. The outer stack, where wind had stripped the snow away, had ice crystals growing from the wood grain, where moisture had migrated out as the temperature fell. She split what she could and brought it inside and built the fire back to something that could actually be called a fire. Then she put on her heaviest coat and her grandfather's skis. Long, narrow touring skis he had brought from Iceland and that she had maintained carefully for 13 years, and she went out to check on the Blaziks. She found Anna and Joseph in their cabin with the fire barely alive, and their youngest child, a girl of 4 named Ruzena, wrapped in every blanket they owned and running a fever that Anna had recognized as the kind that comes from sustained cold exposure in the very young. Joseph had used his last split wood 2 days earlier and had been feeding the fire with furniture since then. 2 chairs and a small table that had been a wedding gift from Anna's mother in Bohemia. His tone when he opened the door was the particular tone of a man who has been responsible for keeping his family alive and has reached the boundary of what his available resources allow him to do about it. He was not ashamed in front of Marta, because Marta was the kind of person in front of whom shame would have been a waste of energy that could be used for something else. He simply said, "We need help." She skied back to her cabin and returned twice more that afternoon, bringing split wood from her supply each time. She could not transport large quantities on skis, but she could transport enough to keep their fire alive and their cabin at a survivable temperature. She wrapped the child in a dry wool blanket she had brought from her own store and sat with her for an hour while her fever began to come down. By the time Marta left for the last time that evening, the cabin was warm enough that you could see breath in it, but not feel cold in it, which was the right side of the line. 2 days later, when the roads became passable enough for a horse, she learned from a passing freighter that 3 cabins to the north had lost their fires completely during the storm. 2 families had sheltered with neighbors who had more wood. One family, a young couple from Ohio named Garrett and Louise Perkins, who had filed their claim the previous spring and had not yet learned what a Dakota winter required, had spent the worst 2 days of the storm in their root cellar, which lacked ventilation and had no heat source. They had survived. Garrett Perkins had lost 2 toes to frostbite. Louise was pregnant, and the stress of the exposure had put her in a condition that required doctor Albright's attention for the better part of a week. They were, by the standards of that winter, the lucky ones. The Dakota winter of 1883 to 1884 killed livestock across 4 territories. In Spink County alone, the January continuation of that same storm system that began in late November was later estimated to have killed more cattle than any previous winter event in the territory's recorded history. Families that had come into the season with what they believed were adequate supplies found those supplies inadequate when temperatures dropped to ranges that accelerated consumption rates no one had planned for. Wood that had dried through the summer burned too fast in cold this severe because the temperature differential drove the combustion rate up, while the cold simultaneously reduced the efficiency of heat retention in structures that had been built for ordinary winters. People burned what they had, then burned what they could find, then burned what they had built with. A man named Otto Riegert in Clay County burned his wagon disassembled by pieces over the course of 4 days. His horses died in the barn from cold because he had used their shelter's wood framing for fuel. Marta Voss burned her split wood and her lamp oil and slept in a chamber that never dropped below 47 degrees, even on the worst nights of January. Her milk cows survived because she had insulated the barn's north wall with loose hay bales stacked 2 deep and banked earth against the outside foundation in the fall, a technique her grandfather had described for keeping Icelandic livestock shelters functional in hard weather. Her hens laid through February, which in Dakota Territory in the winter of 1883 to 1884 was something close to a miracle, though it was not a miracle, but a consequence of the supplemental warmth that leaked from the underground chamber through the cabin floor and the earth surrounding it, maintaining a microclimate in the henhouse attached to the cabin's south wall that was several degrees warmer than the open air. Franklin Cord came by in March, after the roads opened. He had heard about the Perkinses. He had heard about the Riegert wagon. He had heard about Carl Brown crossing 4.5 miles of blizzard to find the only cabin in the Eastern Valley that had viable warmth to offer. He sat at Marta's table with his hat in his hands again, which was the posture he seemed to adopt when he was in the process of revising an opinion he had held with some confidence. He said, "I want you to understand that I intend to mention your method to every homesteader who comes through my office for the next 5 years." She said she would be grateful if he would explain it correctly and not make it sound simpler than it was, because the excavation alone required specific soil conditions and the turf lining required cutting the right species of sod from the right location and a great deal of patience with the fitting of blocks. And a person who tried to build it in sandy soil or with the wrong grass would end up with a collapsed room and a broken floor and very little warmth. He said he understood and would say so. She said, "Good." Heinrich Braun arrived the following week with Josef Blazek, and the two of them spent an afternoon with Marta, going over the dimensions and methods in enough detail that they could replicate the essential elements on their own claims. Heinrich asked about the turf-cutting tool, the modified spade with the guide rail, and Marta gave him the tool itself, keeping the measurement specifications she had written out so that she could have another one made. Joseph asked about the lamp alcove and the clay chimneys for the ventilation shafts. She showed him the ones she had fired and explained the process. He was a practical man, and he understood it immediately. He said that in Bohemia, His grandfather's house had a chamber beneath the kitchen for similar reasons, and that he had forgotten about it until now. She said that was how it usually went. The old knowledge did not disappear. It went quiet until someone needed it badly enough to remember. By the following spring, Heinrich Braun had completed a version of the underground chamber beneath his own cabin. It was not identical to Marta's. His soil composition was different, containing more sand in the upper layers, which required him to install horizontal timber shoring along the upper third of the walls before he could apply the turf lining. But the principles were consistent, and when he tested it with a closed lamp for 4 hours on an April evening and found the temperature at 57 degrees, he came by the next morning to tell her. He said it in the same matter-of-fact tone he would have used to report that a calf had been born or a fence repaired. That was his way. Marta understood that it was also a form of acknowledgement, and that from Heinrich Braun, that was quite a great deal. The circuit preacher Elias Peck, to his credit, mentioned Marta's chamber in 2 of his circuit services that spring. He framed it, characteristically, in terms that connected it to broader principles about human ingenuity and the obligations of community. He said that a woman had built something in the Dakota Territory that had kept people alive, and that those people had not been kept alive by charity or by luck, but by the deliberate application of knowledge to a specific and urgent problem. He said this constituted an example worth learning from. Marta heard about it secondhand from Anna Blazek, who had been present at one of the services, and she found that she agreed with his interpretation more than she had expected to. Dr. Albright, who was not a man given to formal declarations, nonetheless wrote a brief account of the underground shelter for the Vermilion newspaper in April of 1884. He described the construction in sufficient technical detail that a competent builder could follow it, and he noted that the chamber had maintained temperatures 40 to 50 degrees above the surface during the winter's worst periods, using a lamp that consumed approximately 1 quart of coal oil per day. He calculated that the cost of that fuel for the entire winter, from November through March, came to approximately $11.40, against which he set the cost of the alternative, which was whatever you were willing to assign to the deaths and permanent injuries that occurred in the valley that winter to people who had not had access to similar shelter. He did not state that cost explicitly. He said only that the mathematics were not complex. The newspaper account was picked up by a territorial paper in Yankton and then by a Milwaukee agricultural journal that served a readership of German and Scandinavian immigrants across the upper Midwest, many of whom had family knowledge of similar techniques from the old country and who recognized in Marta Voss's construction a practical application of principles they had been taught in childhood but had not thought to apply to the specific conditions of life on the northern plains. Letters arrived at the Vermilion post office through the summer of 1884, addressed to Mrs. M. Voss and containing questions about soil selection, turf cutting, ventilation shaft angles, and the clay chimney construction method for the lamp alcove. She answered every letter she could in the evenings, in the careful handwriting she had practiced at her grandfather's table in Iceland, using the arithmetic and the principles he had given her as the language through which she communicated things that the language of ordinary comfort could not quite reach. She proved up her homestead claim in 1887 and received title to her 160 acres without difficulty. She never remarried. Her claim yielded wheat in good years and disappointment in bad ones, which was the standard experience of Dakota Territory farming, and she managed both with the equanimity of a person who had learned to measure success against survival rather than abundance. The underground chamber remained in use beneath her cabin for as long as she lived there, which was until 1911, when she sold the property to a Norwegian family named Krogstad and moved to Vermilion to live with her niece. She was 62 years old and in excellent health. The Krogstad family used the chamber for root vegetable storage and found, as Marta had promised them, that it maintained 50 degrees year-round without any active management whatsoever. She died in 1919 at the age of 70, which meant she lived long enough to see the end of the First World War, and long enough to hear that airplanes had been used in combat, which she found interesting but not surprising, because she had spent most of her life being shown that the solutions to hard problems were usually available if you were willing to look for them in unexpected places. A local historian named Margaret Sutton interviewed her in 1917 for a project on pioneer women's contributions to territorial development. And in that interview, Marta was asked what she considered the most important thing she had learned during her years on the Dakota claim. She said she had learned that the earth does not withhold its warmth from people who are willing to go deep enough to find it. She said this not as a figure of speech, but as a technical observation, because she was a precise person who meant what she said, and what she meant was exactly that. The warmth was always there, at 6 feet down, in the clay and the stone and the ancient stored heat of 10,000 summers. Available to anyone who had the knowledge, the tools, and the willingness to dig. The original cabin on the Voss claim was demolished by the Krogstad family in 1923 to make way for a frame house of more modern construction. The underground chamber, being underground, remained. It filled in gradually over the following decades as the timber framing that supported the trapdoor access rotted away and the opening above it settled. A University of South Dakota archaeological survey conducted in 1962 on the site as part of a broader study of Homestead-era structures in the Vermilion Basin documented what the lead archaeologist described in his field notes as an anomalous subfloor depression with evidence of deliberate wall construction. Specifically, the compressed and decayed remains of what appeared to be stacked organic material along the chamber walls, consistent with turf or sod block construction. The fieldstone shoring around the foundation elements was noted as unusually careful for a domestic structure of the period. The survey recorded the chamber's dimensions, which matched the specifications in Marta's original flour sack drawings that are preserved today in the Yankton County Historical Society's collection, donated by her niece in 1933. The ventilation shaft scars were still visible in 1962, 2 depressions in the soil at the points where the shafts had exited beneath the cabin's skirting. The gravel floor of the chamber had compressed but remained intact at the time of the survey. The clay lamp alcove housing, partially collapsed, retained its basic shape. The archaeologist noted in his field report that the chamber showed evidence of long-term use, with the floor gravel worn smooth in a path between the ladder access point and the southeast corner, where a flat stone, larger than the surrounding gravel, was positioned as if it had served as a seat for a very long time. There is a principle at work in Marta Voss's story that extends beyond turf construction or thermal mass or Dakota Territory winters, and it is this. The knowledge that keeps people alive in hard conditions is almost never invented from nothing. It is inherited, carried across oceans and generations, and the deaths of the people who held it before, kept alive in the hands of people who understood that practical wisdom is not a luxury, but a form of life itself. Marta's grandfather gave her a tool and a set of principles. She carried them for 13 years on a homestead claim in conditions that were designed by every feature of the landscape and the climate and the social arrangements of the territory to make her dependent on the charity and judgment of others. She chose instead to go down into the earth and use what she had been given. The earth gave her back exactly what it always gives to people who know how to ask, not comfort, but survival. Not warmth as a gift, but warmth as a consequence of understanding. Not luck, but the thing that looks like luck from the outside when you cannot see the work that made it possible. If this account of Marta Voss's life and work has meant something to you, If you found yourself sitting straighter as the temperature in the chamber climbed, if you wanted to know what happened to Heinrich Braun's son, or whether the Perkins baby survived, then subscribe to this channel right now and leave a like on this video. These stories are recovered from Land Office records and County Historical Society archives and letters written in kitchens that no longer exist, and the work of finding them and telling them correctly takes time and care, and the continued support of people who believe that the knowledge of how ordinary people survived extraordinary conditions is worth preserving. Drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. We read every one. And if you know of a story like Marta's, a piece of forgotten practical wisdom from your own family's history, a technique that kept people alive in conditions that should have been unsurvivable, tell us. That is what this channel is for.